Well, David, welcome to Gospel Conversations and virtually to the Antipodes.
Thank you.
Uh, we're going to do three chats around largely Gregory of Nyssa, and I know that Gregory is one of your favourites. One of your favourite theologians, philosophers, however you'd like to categorise him. But in the evangelical tradition, which I'm on the edges of, might be the way to describe it, he's certainly not well known. And I think it's a rather a tragedy that his works are not more widely read. And we've in our third talk, we will talk about the de facto rivalry between him and St. Augustine. But for the moment, let's talk about Gregory. And I think we've got to assume our audience, by and large, are not scholars and academics. And so a bit of an introduction to Gregory would be good. If you could start off there about him, the Cappadocians, and their influence.
The Cappadocian Fathers, for those who don't know, at least the principal Cappadocian Fathers, that is a fairly remarkable group of men, and actually at least one woman, who came from an area now in Turkey, of course, in Asia Minor, who in many respects are chiefly responsible for the triumph of Nicene orthodoxy and later Christian tradition. Gregory of Nyssa was the younger brother of Basil the Great. Basil's dear friend, Gregory of Nazianzus, is another of the Cappadocian Fathers. As I say, there are other figures like Gregory Thaumaturgus who sometimes are placed in their company in Cappadocia, but a figure of extraordinary significance for Gregory himself was his sister Macrina, his and Basil's sister. And we'll see, I think in our next conversation you wanted to talk about on the soul and resurrection, which is a sort of Socratic dialogue with his sister that suggests that a great deal of his teaching was influenced by her. She was an ascetic. She didn't write, but what we know of her, we know of through him. He was the youngest of the three great Cappadocians. He's also speculatively the most brilliant. I mean, all three were very impressive thinkers, but Gregory, and by the end, was the most original, the most inspired. The one who, in a sense, developed a philosophical and a theological system that didn't really perfectly fit into any of the standard categories of the time. I mean, like everyone at the time, he was something of a Platonist, but there are aspects of his thought that are far more original than anyone else of the time can boast. He's remembered as the pillar of orthodoxy. That's one of his titles. And this is curious because he was also a universalist, and in fact the most thoroughgoing universalist perhaps of the whole patristic period. No one was more openly or more systematically or more relentlessly insistent on universal salvation than Gregory.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's go back to that. But first of all, I'd like to explore a little bit more what you alluded to in his innovative thinking. As you said, he was breaking some boundaries, framing things in new ways. Could you go a little bit deeper on that?
Well, I mean, there are any number of ways in which he stands apart from his time. he's arguably the first metaphysician who, in any significant way, explored the metaphysics of divine infinity, for instance. Infinity was ascribed to God by, well, actually very rarely in Platonic tradition. The infinite was not taken to be a positive attribute for many schools of thought, until fairly late in the development of Hellenistic philosophy. And he had his own anthropology, had his own approach to an understanding of the nature of the human being, the nature of creatures as thoroughly dynamic expressions of being in relation to a God who is infinite. And I don't think anyone before Gregory, for instance, was as successful as he at arguing that the very things that for a more standard metaphysics would be seen as separating humanity from the divine, that is, the mutability, the changeability of human nature, Gregory was able to treat as the very terms of union with God. That is, he had a very specific theology of the way in which human beings are related to God's infinity and union with God. That was his rather creative use of a verse from Paul, of a sort of eternal dynamic ascent into the divine, that our union with God, our eternal union with God, would be one also of eternal novelty, of epectasis, of being stretched out into an ever greater embrace that by virtue of the divine infinity is inexhaustible, and by virtue of the inexhaustibly changing nature of the creature is nonetheless something in which we can participate.
Yeah.
I'm getting a bit recherché, but just let me say, all of this in its own way is quite original. These are new ways of approaching the mystery of the human relation to God. I should have pointed out, by the way, when I was talking about the Cappadocians, we should situate them in time.
Yes.
Right. These are 4th century figures. Gregory was born around 335, we think, and he disappears from the record around 395. So it's a span of about 60 years there. We don't know when he died or how, but about 395 is when he sort of disappears from the horizon of the historical record. And this is arguably the most significant moment in doctrinal history for Christianity, because this is the period when the great ecumenical councils, the earliest ecumenical councils, came into being, and much of the grammar of Christian orthodoxy, much of the regularization of Christian doctrine, much of what we understand now as simple Christian orthodoxy, small o, had its terms defined, rigorously tested, argued over at times acrimoniously in that period. So the Cappadocians are figures in the history of the church than whom there could be none more important. Their role in Trinitarian doctrine and the understanding of the incarnation, of Christology, the nature of the Holy Spirit, became in a very real way the foundation of all subsequent Christian doctrinal and metaphysical orthodoxy.
Yes. Now, of what you've said, I want to dive into what I would call Gregory's anthropology. You talked about it being very dynamic and animated by its metaphysics, by its sense of its participation in the infinite, and that's one of the things I find enormously inspiring. It's almost, to me, pre-romantic. As a matter of fact, this morning I was comparing his chapter on speech with Coleridge's Aeolian harp.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah. So we'll go back to that in a moment. But first of all, could you just help us a little bit more on the way that the Cappadocians formulated the doctrine of the Trinity, because, as I understand it, it was, Athanasius made a groundbreaking start, but they, as it were, finished the work. And perhaps you could explain for our listeners why they were so important. I mean, what was up for grabs? If the Cappadocians hadn't done what they'd done, what would we be left with?
You've got to understand that before the conversion of Constantine, there had never been a consensus across the Christian ecumeny on a lot of things. The Christian life consisted to a great extent in a certain style of existence, in a certain law of corporate charity, and in certain affirmations like Christ is risen, Christ is Lord, Christ is the Son of God, Christ is God in some sense. But in what sense? Because, even there were scriptural ambiguities in the first chapter of John, whereas the Father is spoken of as Otheos, the God, which in the Greek of the time was the typical formulation for God in the absolute sense. The Logos is spoken of merely as Theos, which could be interpreted as meaning God, but in a derivative sense. Was he less? And the venerable, and in some ways older, and scripturally every bit as defensible position, especially in the eastern part of the empire and around the intellectual center of Alexandria, both the most astonishingly cosmopolitan city of late antiquity and the most violent and, the most contentious. The tradition was to think in various terms, what we now call subordinationism, but rather, it was a metaphysics that made perfect sense in some way, that the Father, being inaccessibly transcendent, enters into relation with lower reality by generating a son or a logos who is a lesser manifestation, literally a dephtheros theos, a secondary God. And this was considered perfectly orthodox. Understand that the Son was less than the Father and the Spirit less than the Son. The Spirit might not even be considered God because he's not called as such, at least not explicitly in Scripture. On the other hand, there were figures like Athanasius who argued vigorously that not only the testimony of Scripture, but the whole logic of salvation required a formulation of co-equality, or at least that was the direction his thought went, and that the Cappadocians took up. And the reason for this, if you think about it, is very simple in one sense. The understanding of salvation that was universally embraced, more or less, in the 4th century was that in Christ, God had become present and become human so that humans could be joined to the divine nature directly and become divine. Athanasius has the famous formulation, but he's not the only one who says, God became human that human beings might become God. Right. Excuse that noise. I can't turn it off for some reason.
It's okay.
And if this is so, then the question becomes, in what sense can Christ join us to the Father? Because if Christ is less than the Father, then in what sense does he actually make God directly present to us and us directly present to God? And there's a logic. Only God can join us to God. Only God in the full sense can join us to God in the full sense. How are we joined to the Father? Well, through the Son. And this will, of course, be carried over into later doctrinal disputes and later councils with regard to the Spirit. Well, how are we joined to the Son? Well, in the sacraments, in the life of sanctification. If only God can join us to God, then the Spirit too must be God. Now, even then, the Cappadocians would be hesitant to use the term otheos in the full sense for the Son and the Spirit. Somehow that would still be an honorific designation peculiar to the Father. Nonetheless, they argued more persuasively than anyone else before them, and the co-equality of the persons. And this fundamentally altered the way also Christians understood the relationship between creation and God. That is, if God isn't related to creation by a sort of economic reduction of his nature so that he can come into contact with finite reality, then there must be something much more radically, on the one hand, transcendent, and on the other, immanent in the way in which God is present to creation. It's not a matter of being part of a chain of causes or, a continuum of entities, but rather that God, in his fullness, somehow is, well, to use the term of Augustine's, nearer to me than my inmost parts, high, but superior to my utmost self,
Yeah.
higher than my utmost self.
So what you're saying, though, David, I think to make this clear, I mean, within the last year at our church, we got a relatively good sermon on the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea. But I think it gave people the impression that what today we have with the very, let's say, high view of Christ as co-equal with God, not a reduction, that was, everyone believed that. And at the edges, there was a little bit of heresy that needed cleaning up at the Council of Nicaea, and that was quickly done. And everyone always thought what we thought, whereas what you're saying is no. The human mind couldn't really, it was too much of a breakthrough to the human mind to conceptualize that a man was God without reduction.
And as the conversation, the period of the councils, which begins in the 4th century and stretches on well into the 7th and 8th, well, if you're Catholic, after the period of the Counter-Reformation, they include all sorts of later councils too, but the period in which Christian doctrine was formulated, the issue was always, the central issue was always the sort of inconceivable notion that Christ was both fully God and not simply in a derivative or honorific sense, but God in the sense that in him the real presence of the source and end of all existence, the depth of God himself was present, but also was fully human. And that these weren't two juxtaposed realities, but that he was both at once in one person. Well, this is conceptually difficult, right? And nothing could be more inaccurate than to think that the Nicene Council simply ratified what was the general understanding over against a few aberrant sects that had arisen. Quite the contrary. Diversity of views goes back to the time of the New Testament. It's clear. I mean, we see there already profound arguments over issues of doctrine, issues of communal life, all sorts of things. And the subordinationist tradition that I've spoken of, at least, I mean, I don't really even know if I like that term, but that's the standard one, was in many ways less, it was older than, arguably, than the Nicene settlement, and was perfectly respectable, and was in fact the mainstream opinion, and also of many figures that we would consider that the church would call saints in later years. It was not until the issue had to be argued out in terms of what was really at stake. What are we saying? What do we believe about salvation? What do we really, how do we interpret these texts? And the texts are, you could go through them verse by verse, especially in the Greek. They can be read in a great diversity of ways. It may seem surprising to us. We point to the 1st chapter of John and say, well, it says right there, the Logos. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, the Logos was God. But what we don't see in English, but that's, incandescently obvious in the Greek, is that God there is not, is in the first case we're talking about ortheos, and in the second case simply about theos, which is a word with extraordinary plasticity in the ancient world. All sorts of things were called gods. Saints were called gods. I mean, John of Damascus and other church fathers often speak of the saints as gods.
Yeah,
because they don't mean God in the sense of God Most High. They just mean a divinized creature.
Yeah. So the picture of Gregory that now you're painting is that whilst ironically he was one of the constructors of what is today known as Orthodox Christianity, small o Orthodox Christianity. And one of the ironies in behind that is that he was a thorough universalist.
Yeah.
Let's leave that aside for the moment. But and the implications of the fact that a thorough universalist was the construct of orthodoxy. But leaving that aside, actually, to be fair to him in his context, he was more of an innovator. He was more of somebody who was stretching and lifting the interpretation of what God had done in Christ.
Yeah. Oh, very, very much. I mean, this is the interesting thing about it. All the Cappadocians, I mean, they were not simply arguing settled orthodoxy against novel heresies. That's not what they were doing. They, in fact, were the innovators. They were looking for a conceptual language that was adequate to what they believed had occurred in Christ, but for which the proper formulations as yet had not been agreed upon.
Yes.
And so conceptually, now in terms, some of this was just like the use of portmanteau terms, like God is one ousia in three hypostases. Well, we would make a mistake if we thought that these are technical terms of great clarity. They're not meant to be. One substance, three substances or subsistences. But what they did do was lay down demarcations within which the next phase of reflection became possible. Every dogmatic decision, in one sense, would close down any number of avenues of possible speculation, but in so doing would open up immeasurably larger territories of speculation, because the speculative grammar always brought with it new mysteries, new complications. It clarified much of the confession of previous generations.
Yeah, and
also made it more mysterious. But the thing I want to point out is what's interesting about Gregory is not so much his participation in the post-conciliar debates. His brother was very engaged in them. Gregory of Nyssa was. Gregory himself wrote the long, rather boring treatises against Eunomius, a figure who was, in the subordinationist camp. It was called a semi-Arian, but I mean, these terms are polemical and should be ignored. But Eunomius was a representative, and he was a very talented representative of what was a perfectly legitimate older system of Trinitarian thought. It just wasn't adequate to the full range of Christian affirmation and belief in language to the degree that the language of the Cappadocians was. The Cappadocians won in part, or rather their arguments won. The Nicene settlement won in part because of the emperor, but the Cappadocians won the argument in part just because they had better arguments. But Gregory of Nyssa is interesting because it's what he does apart from those debates in his own theology, his own system, because you're right. Once you've established this, what does it mean to say that Christ, in Christ God, has entered into immediate communion with humanity? What is humanity? How does one man, by way, how is it that God, by becoming one man in another sense, is present in all of humanity, pervades the entirety of human experience, and is available to all of the Spirit? And this leads to him, Gregory of Nyssa, that is, coming up with all sorts of fascinating claims about what it is to be human, what it is to be truly human, how God creates us, how God created humanity from the vantage of eternity as opposed to the process of creation and time, and how these two relate. And here he far surpassed his brother and Gregory of Nyssa in the range of just speculative genius, and also theological profundity. I mean, it's the picture of the human that emerges from it is one of the sort of radical coherence, radical community, such that the human essence itself is a community before it's individuated in persons.
yes, now I want to go into that, but just before we do, I want to run an idea past you
Yeah.
about Gregory's genius. And as you said, he's a speculative philosophical genius. But I actually also think he was immensely poetic. And his enormous command of because what you're saying, you and I both know that if you actually get to read on The Making of Man, it's actually relatively simple, but he develops the argument by magnificent analogies, one of which I've just alluded to, the Aeolian harp. And I have this thought that, you know, it's also a great work of literature on the making of man, and that he builds a philosophically coherent argument, charting unknown territory in probably the most profound subject we could, i.e., what is it to be a human being? But he does so, he can do it and create new language because of this, as it were, you know, poetic genius he has. I like thinking of it as romantic theology, and not so.
Well, and you know, I would point out among his many accomplishments, he is considered one of the fathers of the spiritual, of the mystical tradition, if you will, but the spiritual tradition. In two of his treatises, there are more than two in this vein, but the two that one should know. I mean, the Life of Moses, which is an exercise, on the one hand, of late antique exegesis. As you probably know, no one was a literalist or a fundamentalist about anything. Not Jews, not Christians, not pagans. They believed in the spiritual meaning of the text being something that had to be discovered, prescinded by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. In each reading, it might be different from reader to reader, but it was a spiritual meaning that was paramount. But what he does with the Life of Moses is he turns this into a treatise, a mystical treatise about the ascent of the soul into God's infinity. And the other is his great commentary on the Song of Songs, which you know, is, and I should point out that all the Cappadocian Fathers were influenced by Origen, who is the real father of the spiritual tradition, who also wrote a great commentary on the Song of Songs. But Gregory's, you're right, it has all these odd, you might almost say premonitory hints of a kind of almost romantic vision of the soul as this infinite, insatiable energy is plunged by its eros for the divine, striving, not tragically striving, but nonetheless moved by this insatiable hunger for the beauty of God and to ever deeper communion. And it is incredibly absorbing to read both those texts. But you see it, as you say, you're right, you see it even, and of course, we separate dogmatic, apologetic, mystical treatises into different categories. And one of the reasons why the fullness of Gregory's system of thought wasn't fully appreciated at times in previous centuries is that, recent scholarship, let's put it that way, is that the full system is visible only if you read all the different dimensions of his thought. And if you treat these as all, you know, the spiritual treatises, the dogmatic, the apologetic, they're all part of the same picture taking shape. And also the exegetical treatises, like On the Making of the Human. And they're the vision that emerges, as you say, is romantic, it's beautiful, it's poetic, it's also late antique, Neoplatonic, you know, it's all these things at once.
Yes, I've thought about the Life of Moses, that a comparative text against which Gregory does a much better job would be Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, you know, which was sort of afflicted by a bit of a Puritan.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if we enjoy the Pilgrim's Progress, we all at least pretend to at some point in our life. But that's a drearier, I mean, it's sort of boring one-to-one allegories, you know, Pope and pagan gnawing on the bones of Christian martyrs. I say, you know, really.
So let's go down, but not down, but let's now go to On the Making of the Human, and critically, if I could just as a segue into that, recollect what you've just said, which is once you have a high view of Christ as co-equal with God, that necessarily, almost immediately, that demands you create a high anthropology.
Yeah.
And the landscape against which you're going to understand this has to change, and you've already alluded to that. That by landscape I mean, the created order in which we live and who we are. I have long felt Hebrews chapter 2 is one of the most significant chapters in the Bible, where I think 1 and 2 are really developing a very, very high anthropology.
Right.
As you know, you and I know because we've read this treatise a lot. Most people wouldn't. If they were going to read a book on the making of humanity, accomplishing the kind of innovations around transcendence and the presence of the infinite in the finite, they could expect a boring book. But it's the sheer physicality of the book that's extraordinary, where, I just wanted to perhaps mention a couple of the chapters and get your thought on them, but I was just reading chapters 9 and 10. I think 9 is on speech. And having made this epic claim that humanity is made in the image of God, and having developed that, he goes into, I thought, an extraordinarily accurate description of the physicality of the organs of speech. And that whilst he's right down there in the cheek, the tongue, cartilages, perforated bones, he's really... But in that very same text, it's the music of the universe. That's why I compared it to Coleridge's Aeolian harp.
Yeah.
That is playing across this text. Could you comment on that image and that style of Gregory's?
Well, I'm not sure I can say it better than you yourself just said it. On the one hand, of course, for those who don't know, the purpose of the treatise was to conclude a commentary that his brother Basil had left unfinished at the time of his death on the 6 days of creation, the Hexameron. So this allowed Gregory, to do things that his brother would not have done. Talking about the creation of the human, it would have been... I'm not sure Basil would have been nearly as daring either in discussing the physicality or in the speculations on the eternal nature of the human. But I've always thought that this, for Gregory, is part of the fascination of the story of creation and of the story of the incarnation, is that he recognizes the animality, the physicality, the degree to which, especially for fallen humanity, in preparation for the fall, Patrick, he talks about preparing certain organs, among them organs of procreation and all that, to be appropriate to the life we live in this mortal flesh now. But at the same time, he realizes that even in this condition, he's always, and you get this feeling in so many of his other writings, like his sermons on Ecclesiastes, when he denounces slavery, is that he recognizes this sort of divine light in this, this divine music in even in the human, and even in its most indigent and coarsely physical form. I don't know if this is actually what you're getting at when you talk about it, but it does strike. I don't know if there's another writer of his time or place who would have been so adept or so dizzying at times in balancing the two.
I speculate a lot about the curse of the doctrine of sin. I mean, my criticism of a lot of Christianity is that its anthropology seems to start and finish with a declaration that mankind is a sinner, and that's the diagnostic that is applied. Which has been a terrible, I often say, that if the church was God's advertising agency, he would have sacked it for destroying the brand.
Yeah.
And but Gregory doesn't start there. He starts with humanity as the ruler of all, and then really logically says, well, what capacities would we need?
Right, and in a sense, he even starts at the end, doesn't he? I mean, he starts the creation of the of humanity starts because, of course, he does this wonderful thing where he takes the two different creation accounts, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and makes them, so to speak, two different creative horizons within God's working. He begins with the human being is already glorified, already united to Christ, already in its totality, all human beings together rejoicing in and divinized by the presence of God. And from there, that's the primordial creative act of God, the eternal already accomplished end. And from there then unfolds, well, even under the conditions of sin, how does God do this? How does God create us in time? This being not just the end of the story, but its foundation, its beginning. And so rather than starting from the sort of tragedy of a promising creature created in a limited landscape of possibilities, who makes a mess of things, condemns himself and his descendants, not just to death, but in the Western tradition, to an inheritance of guilt, and whatever, that's actually an interval in the story for Gregory that's surpassed before the story even gets underway. And so you're confronted first and foremost with this dizzying claim that humanity created after the image of God in the beginning was nothing less than the totality of all human beings throughout time, united in a single body, divinized, joined to Christ, and thoroughly plunged into the life of God.
Yeah.
That's where the story begins. It's actually it's actually almost hypnotic in its, and then arguably there's scholars like John Barrow who in a sense think that Gregory here is actually working in the same way that Origen, the real Origen, not the origin of myth, thought as well. But certainly we have no other figure who lays it out with such extraordinary beauty and coherence in the early church.
Yes, and I have alluded in this conversation to Coleridge's great poem on the Aeolian harp, which is, I mean, I won't go into it now. You'd be as familiar with it as I am.
I'm very familiar with Coleridge.
What intrigues me, David, about that poem was the end where he gets the metaphorical slap on the wrist from his wife for straying outside the boundaries of tight evangelical Christianity, and he sort of apologizes for this wonderful sweep he'd been doing on the presence of God and the music of God throughout creation.
Right. Well, I'm a great champion of the Romantic movement, especially the English Romantic, maybe the German Romantic too, the great rebellion against the mechanization of nature, and I have no problem with a full, robust, red-blooded, seemingly panentheistic vision. Because I think, and this is another reason to read Gregory on the making of humanity, and actually Basil on in Hexameron, because you realize this is a vision of the world on the part. Now, there is a certain degree of the Platonic melancholy there, a certain distrust of matter. You just can't get away from that in the 4th century. And, especially in a fallen world, I think we're aware every time we stub our toe that the material condition is not the ideal one. But They're not talking about a world in which dead matter is the fictile clay by which God creates a working order of mechanisms related to him only in terms of his power. It is really, for him, it's a vision of creation is pervaded by the Spirit of God. It really is. The pneuma, the breath of God, really does permeate, fill, and enliven all things. Life is literally at once the eternal Spirit of God, but actually the breath of God, and
Yeah.
in all things. And I think that it's perfectly healthy to see the romantic rebellion against the mechanized picture, either the dualistic or the materialist version of this picture of creation as nothing but a collection of organic machines, and that matter is something inherently dead, which is brought to life simply as a matter of functional arrangement, but that in itself, uh, you know, for Gregory, creation, everything is just the mirror of the divine nature. And this is, I don't know if you notice this or not, in both Basil and Gregory, they both deny that there's even in any meaningful sense a material substrate. Their understanding of matter, I don't know if you'd say it's Berkeley, I think that's a bit of an anachronism, but their understanding of matter is the or the material creation is that it exists as a coalescence of radiant forms, of psila noemata, pure spiritual forms, and they don't believe that there's any sort of inanimate, non-divine, non-illuminated, purely passive level of material existence. This is a rather extraordinary, and this is something he shared with Basil. That's one of the places where Basil was almost as daring as his younger brother.
Yes, that's very interesting, David. In Gospel Conversations, one of our colleagues who's at the moment he's doing a doctorate in Immanuel Kant and quantum mechanics. He's one of the rare people who understands both. But essentially, I mean, this is one of the things that struck me about Gregory. He's really foreshadowing quantum mechanics. I mean, the world of quantum is exactly what the idea that there are underneath everything little bits of stuff that's, and that's the building blocks of matter. We now know that's actually a fallacy.
Right. Well, in a sense, in that, if that were all he were doing, of course, you could say he's just falling in the grand tradition of understanding materia prima as pure potentiality. And I think, there are real analogies between quantum mechanics and an older Aristotelian Neoplatonic understanding of the atomists were something altogether different. Those who really thought of the atomic or the corpuscular nature of matter as a collection of static bits of matter, inhering in one another. And but you're right. But also with Gregory and Basil, there's such an emphasis on the noetic or the spiritual nature of. I mean, you and I, as physical beings, according to Gregory, are a confluence of ideal formal truths. Right. First, in a sense, we're spiritual ideas. We're composed, almost so to speak, of spiritual ideas, and material existence is, in a sense, a conventional effect of that, a sort of specification, a quantification, maybe a localization of that, but it's not an emergent reality from a lower level, a substratum of matter. We come into existence as material beings only first and foremost as noetic beings.
Yes, and my understanding of quantum mechanics is, I mean, I'm a literary guy. I'm not a scientist, but that as my friend Ron keeps trying to explain to me, the eerie thing about quantum mechanics is that it actually says almost what you've just said, that it appears that physicality arranges itself according to our perceptions.
Well, especially if there's a real collapse of the wave function, and if, as say Eugen, Wigner, and others thought that this collapse is contingent on the observer, their expectations. Now, there are other theories, like say quantum decoherence or many worlds or many mind models, none of which, though, answer all the questions they're supposed to answer. But yeah, the classic picture that comes from the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics is that consciousness is the agency whereby the potentiality wave becomes an actual corpuscular event, and so yeah. That would have made perfect sense to the minds of people, Gregory and others in the tradition, who didn't think in terms of an underlying, so to speak, coarse-grained material substrate that's only secondarily arranged into living order or into spiritual existence.
Yeah. Well, fascinating. And I want to keep going on Gregory, but I want to make a couple of points, ask you to make a couple of points that have occurred to me as we're talking. Number one, for people who would think, oh, how does this fit in with, biblical theology? And number two, how practical is this? My 2 points are this, as to how practical it is, and I'd like your comment on it. I think it's obvious. It surely is no coincidence that this man, who had such a profound view of the dignity, the potentiality, the potential divinity of humanity, was the pioneer of the advocacy that slavery could not be fitted in with the Christian mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we always appreciate just how extraordinary this is, because the entire ancient world, east, west, north, south, accepted bonded servitude. Now, I mean, it was such a basic institution that even those who disliked it, many of the church fathers disliked it and wanted Christians to live on fraternal terms, so to speak, with their slaves, nonetheless would never have imagined that the institution itself could be renounced. I mean, it was just Gregory of Nyssa is literally the first person we have any evidence of the Western tradition, but actually, I would say, in all of human history, to undertake, as he does in that one Ecclesiastes sermon that obviously you've read, an assault on the very notion of slavery, the very institution, all the premises underlying it as being inherently unjust, inherently contrary to Christian faith. There's a lot of radical language in the church fathers. Most people would be quite surprised. Even in the 4th century, there are figures who are denouncing the wealth of the wealthy, and speaking in no uncertain terms of the judgment that would fall on those who, by keeping wealth to themselves and denying it to the poor, were in a sense, murdering the poor. But no one ever went as far as Gregory in actually suggesting that that it was actually possible to imagine that the institution that for many was the foundation of a functional society, bonded servitude, could be rejected by Christians. That this was. Now, it doesn't give you a practical practical politics. He wasn't a political theorist. There was no such thing for the most part. Even Plato, you wouldn't say, The Republic he wasn't a political theorist in the way later political theory developed. And what he's trying to do there, of course, is the sermons on Ecclesiastes were given during Great Lent. Under Constantine, it had become legal to emancipate slaves in the church, manumitio in Ecclesia. You could just go, and the bishop had the power, because you couldn't just manumit slaves without legal warrant and without a legal certificate recognition and a manumission fee. But under Constantine, as part of the amelioration of law in a Christian direction, and this has become possible. Gregory is encouraging. I mean, he's challenging everyone in his congregation, if they really believe that Christ is the Savior, and in fact the one who will divinize every human soul, they should all be setting their slaves free. And you're right. I mean, it's so far outside of the mainstream of what anyone even would imagine to have been possible in the 4th century, that in itself, if that's all we knew about Gregory, would make him one of the most extraordinary intellectual figures of late antiquity.
Yeah. And the other thing, as I read Gregory, because he's, as you know, on the Making of Humanity, begins speculatively in the councils of the Godhead, discussing this plan. And that strikes me as where Paul, I'm assuming it's Paul, goes in Ephesians 1, prior to the foundation of the world.
Right.
Really going back to the same place Gregory went.
Right. I mean, you're chosen in Christ before the foundation of the world. And Gregory certainly has that in mind, because the way the tree, for those of your listeners who haven't read it, what Gregory does with the first creation account of Genesis is to say that in the making of, what does it mean to say, to make humanity in the divine image? The first creation is the ideal creation in the counsels of God, which is also the eternal reality of the perfected creation, of the entirety of humankind in perfect union, because only in perfect union one with another, every single person throughout human history, joined to one another in the bond of love, joined to Christ as the head of the body, and by the Spirit being drawn ever eternally into greater union with God. Only that is a humanity that's the true image of God, because perfect in form, perfect in love, no alienation between humankind and its divine model, a humanity that truly reflects its archetype. Then the second creation account is allegorized, but or interpreted as dealing with the historical unfolding under the conditions of fallenness and death. This is given that a fall, and Gregory's not necessarily, he's not a literalist necessarily. How this fall happens is, he obviously takes for granted, is allegorized as the story of Eden. Under those circumstances, how the fullness of the pleroma, he's in the fullness of the human, that alone can be, and this is a radical statement, only the true image of God can be saved. So it's either everyone or no one for Gregory. And, the premise. Now, in the next treatise that you want to talk about next time, how this works out eschatologically is known, but here, although it's interesting, this is a treatise on creation, yet it begins with an eschatological vision.
And
whereas on the soul and resurrection is about eschatology, but it ends with the first creation. So it's a
yes. And I'd like your comment on something else I've thought about quite a lot. I mean, I think.
But let me just say one last thing. That remember that you're unfolding akaluthia. This is actually a principle in Gregory's thought, that there's an evolution of the human, in a sense, not obviously. Although actually he did believe that if you say in The Making of Man, you see he also says that God created by creating potentialities in nature and then allowing them to develop according to their own powers into full reality. But akaletheia also means the development whereby the totality of humanity through the providence of God not only comes into being successively in time, but then is successively, both in this age and in the age to come before that, which is beyond all ages, perfected until it arrives at that which was its first beginning.
What Greek word you kept using there? I don't know Greek.
Akaletheia. Well, like an acolyte, what it follows, yeah.
And that's the word Gregory uses where?
In explaining, that's just a term he uses for the unfolding in the second creation account and elsewhere, for the unfolding of God's design and the progressive movement from the first seeds he speaks of creation to its ultimate consummation in the transfiguration of all creatures.
And this is a radically different view of, I think we naively tend to have a view of creation. It was like a perfect one-stop shop, don't mess it up. Whereas his view is more of a potentiality and unfolding.
Right, and this will be picked up quite brilliantly after his time by the great Maximus the Confessor. You could argue that for Maximus and for Gregory, creation has not yet happened from our perspective. Creation is that which is in eternity has happened. But the real world, the world that God intends, the real humanity that God intends and creates in the beginning in his eternal counsels is yet to come into being.
Yes.
This world is the foreshadowing of creation.
And this leads to another point I'd like your comment on. I've long thought that the Christian mind has got hijacked by this anthropology of sin, and haven't thought very much about that word anyway. So that the big problem is we're created perfect. The gap is between holiness and sin, whereas that is acknowledged by Gregory, but I think the as it were, the bigger gap is this paradox of created, uncreated, this infinite, finite, and what that is what he's exploring in On the Making of Humanity. How can finite, corporeal, bodily actually incorporate the infinite?
Right. And again, as I said, part of his ingenious solution to this, again picked up by Maximus later, is that the very restlessness and mutability and dynamism that in one sense distinguishes the finite creature as being a synthesis, always become never entirely itself in this world. I mean, each of us, one moment we're a child, and another moment a young man or woman, and another moment we're never fully who and what we are in this world. But in another's, but what we're ultimately called to become is God. I mean, he's quite radical. We're called to be divinized. It's the very dynamism of change, which in one sense is the ontological gulf between the simple, finite, transcendent God and the composite. Finite, the simple, infinite, transcendent God and the composite, finite creature, becomes also the term of union, because we can establish a kind of stability and change in which we're ever changing for the better and for the more, become like he speaks of it as, as if the fountain of the divine nature is pouring into a vessel, we're a vessel, and the vessel is expanding infinitely rather than being overwhelmed, because that very dynamism, that kinesis, that is logically and ontologically what distinguishes us from the divine, becomes practically and spiritually what allows us to become ever more deeply united to the divine in and by the Spirit.
Well, that speaks to one of the paradoxes, challenging paradoxes of the human condition as we get older, of course, is change. And I often have thought, and I've seen in my friends, the melancholy of change. I mean, when kids are young, it's great to have the 6th birthday after the 5th birthday. My next birthday, I'm 70. Like, is this a celebration, or is this, the twilight? And so there's this irony of change, but to which every human being, it's rather poignant. But this gospel speaks to that. That it reframes it as actually growth. As Paul said, yes, the outer man is perishing, but the inner man is being renewed.
Yeah. I think, there's a great poignancy and beauty. I mean, Gregory's aware of the melancholy of change and of loss. He was married, by the way, I should point out, unlike, I don't believe, his brother was ever married, so, but we have evidence, or at least it seems to be the case, that Gregory was married. But he wrote a treatise on virginity, and it seems to be the case that he was widowed. And there's some very beautiful lines. I mean, he actually recommends the unmarried life for those who are too weak for the married life. It's not, he doesn't treat the unmarried life as necessarily the more heroic or the stronger, but for those who are pursuing the ascetic life, part it's because he thinks some people aren't strong enough for the married life, for the spiritual burden of the married life. But he mentions, there are these very moving lines about when you embrace someone you love, you're embracing someone that you will mourn or who will mourn you. So there's something tragic in the condition of change in this life, he understands, which makes it all the more moving when especially in, say, the life of Moses or the Song of Songs, that very, the ephemerality, the transience of things, the change, is sort of becomes the unexpected doorway into a condition of eternal union, eternal love, and this endless, I don't know how to say, odyssey, this endless adventure of ever greater ascent into the divine mystery, into the depths of the divine nature, and as I say, this is picked up later in the tradition by Maximus the Confessor, who's not a moving writer like Gregory. Maximus is one of the severest dialecticians and he writes some of the most god-awful, unreadable Greek, not because it's bad Greek, but because it is willfully condensed, inspissated, impenetrable, and complex. In Gregory, you get the full poetry of the vision, and Maximus not so much so. But even so, those are the two, more than anyone else, who creatively engage the way in which change is at once the tragedy and the liberation from tragedy in our nature.
Perhaps we could later on talk about Maximus, not now though. I'd like to, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I would like to conclude it by asking you to comment specifically on chapter 10, which is the City of the Mind chapter. This magnificent picture he has of synthesis, that in the mind, he views the mind as a marketplace. And I think his major point that he's wanting to make is the synthetic quality of the mind, and which you and I could, it's terribly interesting. Obviously, it foreshadows recapitulation in Ephesians 1:10, the mind of Christ. From my point of view, having, working in the world of innovation and strategy, the Cartesian model is a model of analytics, splitting things up. What no one can get is synthesis, which is magic, which is mystical, which is, as I tell my clients, the closer you get to synthesis, the closer you get to God. I just think it's the most glorious chapter, and I know that you have studied and are about to put out a book, I hope soon, on the soul and the mind and the aspects of thinking that are simply non-reductive to any kind of mechanism, of which synthesis is one. So just final comment on his magnificent vision of the mind at work as
well, I mean, I take it as right. It's also, that's the chapter that has that phrase, the music of reason, right?
yeah.
That we're sort of built as this instrument through which the music of reason plays. But yeah, the image of the mind as a great city with many entrances through the senses, through the apprehensions, and that you know, he speaks of a great city in which people come from all directions, and when they enter the city, they go to all different places. Some are like going to the market, some are going to the churches, right? I find it. I mean, it's fascinating, and in many ways, wonderful picture of human spiritual existence as a kind of, I'm going to put it, not in the Cartesian sense, closed in the way that a single monadic kind of intelligence that operates through the senses inhabits an alien, almost alien, or at least extrinsic mechanism called the body, and uses it to function according to certain certain sort of practical employments. But just the opposite, that the body itself is the body and mind are together the great city that is open to all things, and that reason and the human intellect are a place where all of reality freely enters and congregates, intermixes. You know, I don't know what comment to make on it, except that again, it's an ennobling picture, but it's also a picture that suggests that both spiritually and physically at once, or by the medium of the body, we're actually in direct and immediate communion with the reality beyond us. You know, in modern philosophy, to a very great degree, since you mentioned my book on the mind, the dominant theory for a long, and I would say still the dominant theory of knowledge, is that we know the world by representation. That is, that our senses acquire a certain number of data from the world around us, but then internally, we create a representation in our own sort of internal theater, and that the only world we really know is the one inside our skull. Well, Gregory is in a sense speaking of a very different vision, in which we actually are open to the whole of reality. Each of our senses is yet another way in which the real order of being makes its way into us, and we're open to it. And we're sort of a nested city within the greater city of the whole humanity, within the, you know, the full communion of all created nature in God. And you know, it's a vision that seizes you by its beauty, but I mean, don't overlook the very real sense in which it's saying something radically different than what the modern prejudice tells us. We're not isolated intellects closed up within, you know, sealed up within walking corpses, projecting the outer world on an internal cinema, internal cinema screen, and knowing only the world that's available to us through our own representation of the world to ourselves, and are removed from reality. Instead, we're actually in real communion with the Spirit of God in all things, manifesting itself in the life of the whole, like the wind of you're passing through the Aeolian harp, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I share with you a great admiration for that image and that chapter.
Yes, and there's no need to go there now, but it's obvious adjacency to universal salvation would be clear. Oneness in all things.
Right. Well, I think that'll become increasingly clear, especially if we talk about on the soul and resurrection. But the universalist substance of this treatise lies right there at the beginning, the understanding that there is no humanity, there is no human being in the image of God. There cannot be, except in the full union of all human souls in their shared union with the first good, as he puts it.
So, David, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have. I hope our listeners too.
It's been a great day in general. This is the end of the day for me, the beginning of the day for you. But I'll tell you this: I don't suppose you follow baseball, but my team, the Orioles, today, the pitcher pitched a no-hitter, a complete game no-hitter, which is the first time my team has had such a since the great Jim Palmer in 1969. So I'm in a state of jubilation because if there were no other religion available, salvation, I believe baseball would still be a way to God.
Still do it, yes. Well, for me, it's golf, but
oh, well, then you are going to hell. I
don't go to hell because golf afflicts a misery on you. But yeah. Anyway, as you're talking, just a couple of little peremptory points. Your book on the soul and the mind, when is that coming out, and what would it be called, or don't you know what it's going to be called?
I can't release it. I mean, I'm writing. I've during the shutdown, I wrote 7 books.
Good.
There was a 600-page novel. There was a 400-page book that just came out called Roland and Moonlight. They're 2 theological treatises. But during that whole time, I've been putting together the book on the. I'm trying to decide in the final form how much I can trim it down to as clear and incisive a statement as I can make it, because I'm tired of reading gigantic tomes on philosophy of mind that mostly just keep reciting the same arguments without offering solutions. What I think will be the case will be that I'll be handing in the manuscript in about 6 or 7 months, and it'll appear within the year after that. So it's still probably a year and a half away.
Yeah.
What it's going to be called, I don't know, but if you'd like to name it for me, I'd be grateful. Right now, it's just called Mind.
Mind, okay. And of course, you should make
God.
Is it Mind what, sorry?
Mind, comma, God.
Oh,
that's how it looks. That's the file on my computer.
Oh, good. We should make the obvious point to our listeners that, and this will become clear when we talk about Augustine. Augustine was prolix. Gregory of Nyssa was succinct. His works are like all great poetry, condensed.
Yes and no. I mean, his early work, the Contra Eunomium treatises, there he's a young man. He's doing the dutiful work that was required of him, in part by Basil, to refute the enemies of the Nicene settlement, and that can be kind of exhausting. But when he was writing in his own voice, you're right, he could say a great deal in a very short space. Well, I mean, Augustine could too. It's just Augustine kept going on. Yeah. But you're right. In this treatise on the making, I think. Well, I didn't even pick it up. You can read it in under an hour.
Yeah, exactly. And as we're talking, I was thinking, I hate to give you an idea for another book, but I'm recently reading a book. It's a popularized version of A Great Truth, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, on the Scottish Enlightenment. And I'm thinking, there's a book out there, How Gregory Invented Christianity, or something like that. Yet to be written
that would. Well, it might get me in a certain degree of trouble, but I can see. Well, all right. And by the way, these issues of mind and consciousness, I mentioned the book that just came out called Roland and Moonlight. That's actually much of what will show up in a more rigorous form.
Okay.
In the consciousness book is dealt with there in what I like to think is a very fetching way.
We'll hope to get
joke fetching will be obvious to you when you know what the theme of the book is. But,
Okay,
yeah.
all right. Well, I hope that we get you a few more readers and buyers of that book, David. And yeah,
Oh, well, that's always welcome too. Yeah. I say to everyone, buy 10 copies. Christmas is coming.
that's
You'll
right.
want to give it to some. So
Very good. And
I've
look,
got rent to pay. Yeah.
thank you for your time. And thank
Thanks.
you.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, so have I. And thank you for your life and the way you think and share. It's a blessing to many people.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Even if you do love golf.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.